I'm sure that we can all collectively agree that our clothing quality is a lot worse than it was many, many years ago. Across the board, it just feels like things are very thin and flimsy, and the construction really isn't that great. Things are pilling more easily. And one of the results of all this declining quality is that consumers are treating clothes like disposable items, as opposed to pieces that should really have a long lifespan within their closet. I wanted to look into this further to better understand why this is the case and all of the nuances around it. So today I'm going to be sharing with you everything that I've found about why the quality of our clothes has gone downhill so much over recent decades. And at the end of the video, I'm going to be giving you some tips on what exactly you can do about this. If you want to see more content diving into the nuances of the fashion industry and how to build a more mindful wardrobe, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So in order to better understand the current state of our clothing industry, we do have to take a little bit of a step back in time to the late 1900s. In the 1970s, the average US household was spending roughly 10% of its income on new clothes every year. So this equaled about $4,000 in today's money. Now, if we compare that to what's happening today, we are spending about 3.5% of our income on new clothes, but that equals $1,700 roughly today, and we are buying 5 times more clothes every year. So today, on average, people are adding 68 new items to their wardrobe every year. 68? 68? I'm sorry, that's too much. So to better understand this, I want to talk about clothing production in the late 1900s. Clothing production a couple decades ago was very different than how it is today. Retailers would typically release new collections a handful of times a year. Think fall, winter, spring, summer. And these collections were planned well in advance. Typically a year in advance, sometimes a little bit shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on the retailer. But there was plenty of time to figure out everything from the design to the samples to the actual manufacturing, etc. And this time-intensive process gave retailers the opportunity to focus on things that really aren't much of a consideration anymore today, especially for fast fashion, which is the quality of the item, the craftsmanship, of course, and also the longevity of the item. The overarching goal for retailers back then, outside of profits, of course, was to make clothing that had a certain standard of quality, something that could be worn for years to come. However, despite this being a more slow and thoughtful process, it still had some risks associated with it. If collections don't perform across the board and they get marked down and they get put on clearance and they're just not selling, that's a profit loss for retailers. But this was a risk that was very normal to take for retailers back then because there really wasn't another choice until fast fashion came around, of course. And as a result, they prioritized quality and craftsmanship because they were confident that these would be reasons for things to sell and for customers to return. So this was the case for many retailers a couple of decades ago. Of course, it wasn't the case for every single clothing company out there. I'm talking like JCPenney and Macy's. Think of the retailers that have been pushed out so much because of fast fashion. So with that, let's talk about the rise of fast fashion. And we can't talk about it without talking about its leader, I guess you could call it, at the time, which was Zara. So in the 1990s, Zara kind of made themselves known as a revolutionary fashion company because they were cutting production times from typically, 9 months to a year for the whole process to just 15 days. So think about that. An item could go from a sketch on a piece of paper to in the store within roughly 2 weeks. But how exactly could this happen? There's a lot of different things that Zara did to kind of disrupt the fashion industry. But the main thing that they did that I think is the most important to point out is they produced small batches of products, sent them to stores, got feedback from those stores on how items were performing, and then they would produce larger quantities of those items. So instead of creating 1 to 2 collections a year like JCPenney and Macy's and these other retailers would do, Zara was putting out, a handful of collections every few weeks. And they still do that. Many brands do that. It was fast, of course, but it also dramatically reduced the risk of items not selling. Remember, it all comes back to profits at the end of the day. So whereas retailers, a few decades before were taking the risk of items not selling in exchange for quality and craftsmanship and hopefully a long-term customer relationship, Zara said, nope, we're gonna sell smaller quantities and reduce that risk of things not selling. So that's a very general overview, a very just scratching the surface type of explanation of the shift that happened in the fast fashion industry. Now, I do want to acknowledge there were many, many other things happening at the time that contributed to that shift. So if you want to get a little bit more of a deeper dive on it, More Perfect Union has a really amazing video going into a little bit more detail, a little bit more of the nuances of this shift. I will link it in the description box down below. It helped me a lot with making this video and kind of understanding what the shift actually was and why it was happening. If you want more information as to why outside of the smaller production runs, then feel free to check out that video. So now I want to jump more into today's fashion landscape and what's actually happening now that is contributing to a lower quality of clothing. So first I want to talk about product quality. One of the most significant shifts that has contributed to the decline of clothing quality is this widespread use of synthetic materials. In 1975, synthetic fabrics like polyester and nylon made up only 30% of the global fiber market. And today that number is nearly 70%. And the reason why is because of two main things. Of course, synthetic fabrics are a lot cheaper to produce. Retailers are prioritizing profit above all else, so if they can reduce their margins when it comes to manufacturing, they will. And the other reason why is because synthetic fabrics are extremely versatile. Okay, we see them in everything. They can be backpacks, raincoats, shoes, t-shirts. It's everywhere. It's everything. Like, it makes sense as to why brands would use it more and more over the years because not only is it cheap, but they can do so much with it. However, there is of course very serious trade-offs when it comes to synthetic fabrics. They are really horrible for the environment. They're contributing to microplastics in our ocean. They take forever to biodegrade. We're talking hundreds of years. And of course, that's not to say that natural materials come with their own set of issues. I don't think there's any fabric out there that is perfect. But if you want to learn more about why synthetic fabrics are really not that great, I will link a video above here diving into that topic a little bit more. To continue with product quality, I do want to talk about construction because we have seen a significant decline in how products are actually constructed during the manufacturing process, which is a result of the whole time is money mentality. Garment workers, who are truly the backbone of the fashion industry, are sometimes paid per item rather than hourly. And this type of structure will inevitably lead to a compromise in craftsmanship if they are working on getting as many pieces out the door as possible. Now, just to be extremely clear, not 1 ounce of blame is to be put on garment workers for the quality of clothes today. The blame is on fast fashion brands and these models and strategies that they have in place. And when speed and profit are prioritized over things like safe working conditions and a fair hourly rate, it's no surprise that the product quality will suffer. Now, something else I want to mention is that, yes, I have been talking about fast fashion a lot in this video. However, fast fashion brands are not the only level of brand that is making sacrifices for profitability. I came across a really good example of this on Reddit a couple months ago, and I saved it purposely for a video like this to show you guys. In the post, there's a comparison between 2 Sézanne jeans, and you can clearly see a difference in the quality when it comes to the stitching and the trim. And the person also reported that the fit was a lot poorer as well. So this serves as a really great example that high-end brands cut corners too, in that the promise of quality doesn't always necessarily meet up to reality. Next, I want to talk about brand behavior. So in today's fashion landscape, I think it's pretty obvious that the goal is always going to be profits over quality. It's all about how to churn out as much product as possible while maximizing and skyrocketing revenue. So of course, this relentless pace is leaving little room for quality and craftsmanship and attention to detail, things like that. However, there has been another major shift in brand behavior over recent decades that I want to talk about, which I think has also contributed to this decline in quality. And that is how brands are marketing their products. Quality is no longer the primary selling point, right? It's more about what's on trend and staying relevant. And this is especially true for fast fashion and ultra fast fashion brands. Clothing is no longer produced to withstand the test of time, but rather to withstand the test of social media and to fit these very fleeting aesthetic demands that social media has alongside influencer culture, of course. So the result of this is that consumers at first glance look at a piece of clothing and they think it looks great because it's trendy, it's relevant, it will make them look cool, but they don't think about the lifespan of the item when it comes to both durability as well as relevance. So when fashion becomes disposable, quality is inevitably going to suffer. So speaking of consumer, I want to talk a little bit more about consumer behavior. One of the biggest things that has shifted consumer behavior into this buy more mentality is, of course, the rise of online shopping. We live in a world today where convenience is a priority above all else. However, this type of accessibility, of course, comes at a cost. I personally believe that the rise of online shopping has had a really negative impact on consumers' critical thinking skills. Like if you think about it, going into the store, you're able to touch the fabric, you're able to get familiar with what craftsmanship is. Whereas when you order online, you're kind of taking a gamble on the quality. So now consumers are often driven by visuals, of course, and the ease of the click, as opposed to more thoughtful decision making when it comes to the clothes that they're buying. But this issue definitely does not end with just the rise of accessibility. Our constant need for more and more and to buy this and to buy that has turned into this extremely vicious cycle of constant demand. We buy more, we get accustomed to owning more and the feeling that that gives us, and therefore we demand more. And I think it's really important to understand that no, consumers are not solely to blame for this idea, but what we demand undeniably plays a role within the quality of clothes that is being offered to us. More demand means more product, it means more cutting corners, and it means more cutting costs. Something I think about probably way too often, but I think is a really good example of consumer demand, is the fact that in 2020, Shein made $10 billion. Do you guys remember what was happening in 2020? We were all sitting at home. But despite having nowhere to go and nothing to do, consumers were coming back time and time again because they enjoyed the cycle of newness. And this cycle is affecting multiple things. First of all, our spending habits, but it's also reinforcing the idea that clothes are disposable, and as a result, quality will continue to suffer. Okay, so there's a bunch of information for you guys. Now I want to talk about what you can actually do about it. I'm a huge believer that at the consumer level, there is so much that you can do to avoid lower quality items and help build a wardrobe that will last you a very long time. The first thing I recommend is that you need to train yourself to recognize quality. For me, this first started with understanding the difference between fabrics and choosing which fabrics I want to prioritize. So I, especially going to the thrift store, was able to get a better understanding of what's synthetic and what's natural. Of course, you can always look at the care tag, but I do think it's really important to actually feel the fabric and get a better understanding of how it's actually going to perform in a comfort manner. Like, is it going to feel good on your skin, etc. So when you are shopping, I encourage you to examine the fabric and also examine the construction of the item. Inspect things like the seams. Are they tightly stitched or are they kind of loose and fraying a little bit? Does the fabric feel substantial? Like, can you feel the weight in it? Can you feel the actual quality of it? or does it feel just kind of thin and flimsy? You essentially want to interview the item to make sure it's going to have a long-lasting spot within your closet. My next tip is to, of course, buy secondhand. If you make the effort to go out and shop secondhand and find some pre-loved items, you are lessening the demand for new products. So while of course not every single secondhand piece that you see at the thrift store is going to be the quality that you want, I do think that there is a higher chance of you finding better quality items secondhand, especially because there will be items there that are from decades ago when the production process was focusing more on craftsmanship. I discussed this a little bit more in my video about thrifting secondhand, which I will link above here, but the whole moral of this story is that if you're willing to put in the effort to examine items and just look for pieces that are better quality, your wardrobe is going to thank you. The next thing I want to mention is that repairing is always an option. Things like small holes or loose buttons or buttons that maybe fell off, or a broken zipper, or just a small tear does not automatically mean that item is at the end of its life. I remember when I first moved to college, my mom got me a small sewing kit and I still use it to this day. Now, of course, you know, these things aren't happening super often, but I actually do have about 2 or 3 items in a pile in my closet right now that I have to sew up or I have to change the buttons on. So I'm just waiting for some time to actually sit down and do it. But I think the moral of the story is that teach yourself how to sew. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. If you have a small tear in your clothes or in a t-shirt or something, you can go on YouTube and just look up a very basic video teaching you how to mend the item. I'm not saying you have to become a seamstress. I'm not saying you have to go buy a sewing machine. A thread and a needle really go a long way. And if that's not your expertise or you don't have the time, whatever the case may be, you can always bring your items to a tailor. Now, of course, that costs a little bit of money, but I've personally found that things like changing a zipper or fixing a button, it's quite affordable, of course, depending on who you are, where you live, and what your definition of affordability is. But you have options here. So just remember that repairing is always an option. And the last thing I want to mention is to care for your clothes properly. Treat your items like investments, not like disposable pieces. And more specifically, I find that washing and drying your clothes less is a great way to preserve their quality. My rule of thumb is that if it's not visibly dirty or smelly, I have no problem wearing it a couple of times before throwing it into the wash. Of course, with a few exceptions. And when you do wash your clothes, follow the care instructions. Like, they are there for a reason. Consider using the gentle cycle or cold water. And the other thing that I try to avoid doing is drying my clothes. Of course, there are times where I do it for specific items, but get yourself a clothing rack and just have them air dry. It is way better for the quality of the fibers within your clothes over time. And the other thing that I'm really cautious about is, especially when it comes to sweaters and tops, I'm very careful about putting them on. Like, I try my best not to stretch the neckline out. And I'm also very cautious about how I store them. So for a really long time, I was hanging my sweaters. I don't know what I was doing, actually. I just didn't know any better. But fold your sweaters to keep their shape. You know, there's certain items that should be hung and that should be folded, and that will help extend the quality and the lifespan of the item as well. All right, you guys, this was a very long-winded video. We'll see what I edited down to, but I've been talking for like an hour and a half at this point. I won't put you through that. But if there is anything that you guys want me to expand further on, or any other topics you want me to do a video on, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm always open to ideas. I especially love these research style videos. It helps me learn more. It helps you learn more. It's a win-win. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I am so appreciative of your support, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.